Hi there, my name's Ollie, and I'll be talking about Christianity within Latin America and mission and social impacts till today. So, to start with, we're going to look at where is Latin America? What is it? Latin America is a continent below North America, or the Americas as we call them. Latin America consists of South America, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. These speak Romance languages, and these regions have the same history of the Portuguese and Spanish conquests between the 15th and the 18th centuries. They also share independence movements in the early 19th century. While many nations continue to experience similar and social political trends and recognize a shared heritage, they also differ greatly geographically, climate wise, and national identity. So, even though they are completely different culturally now, they also share a massive heritage. So, who do we start with, and why do we start with Christopher Columbus? Christopher Columbus was born in 1451 and he died in 1506. His ambition or his aim was to reach Asia and create a westward route for trade access to riches such as spices, silks, and jewels. More directly, he wanted to do this by bypassing over dangerous and costly overland routes controlled by the Middle Eastern powers. But he drastically misjudged the Earth's size and ended up landing on the Americas, what we now call the Americas, instead, leading to the name the West Indies. He was convinced to the day he died that he went to Asia, though he did not, and he was wrong. So these were his voyages. In 1492, he went to the Bahamas. On the second, he went to the Caribbean islands such as Jamaica and established settlements in Hispaniola. The third was South American mainland, and the fourth was Central America, touching the coast of Honduras, Costa Rica, and Panama. So, what are the impacts on Latin America? Well, and why do we still think about him? He's a complex person to remember, and the reason why we remember him is because he created, even though access to trade, he also created the reason for European colonialism. It's thanks to him, when I say thanks, ironically, that European colonialism started there. Thus came the start of European influence. As many people there who were Catholic, as in Spaniards at the time, there was a huge focus on preaching and converting. So he has a very complex legacy. He's also celebrated as a navigator, but you would argue, or you could argue, that he was quite a poor navigator, considering he wanted to go to Asia and he ended up in where we now know as the Americas, or Latin America. So Catholics went over, as well as Christopher Columbus, with mission work and economic ambition. So we know that they're intertwined. The efforts that were taken by Catholics over to turn people into Christians and other Catholics and evangelize was what we would now call a very violent evangelism. They did it by any means necessary to them in their eyes. We don't see anything in Protestantism because that comes in later, and in 1517, Martin Luther was the forefront of this new movement. Protestantism of protest was within the words, so it was against Catholicism. But we don't see this much later, so we won't tap into this too much now. We know about what was going on because Bartolome de las Casas, who was an activist within indigenous and social abuse for slaves, he was a social activist fighting for this, fighting against what was going on, or fighting for the freedom and liberation of slavery with indigenous abuse. So, what we see here, and we're very thankful for him writing about that, is that we now know is that what was going on is that Europeans brought over diseases, and there were protests going on, and for that reason, native indigenous people were dying out or fighting against it due to war. This meant that economically it didn't make sense for people to have native slaves. It was too costly for a multitude of reasons. Um, so they brought African slaves over between the 1500s to the 1800s. This brought over 5 million to the Caribbean, 5 million to Brazil, and 500,000 or over 500,000 to other Spanish colonies. For this reason, it brought over a massive, incredibly diverse range of belief systems, and this created a hierarchy of skin colour and race. Throughout this, a term called popular and traditional Catholicism happened. At the top, we have traditional Catholicism. These were people who were Spaniards, their heritage was Spanish, they were born in Spain. Then we have under that people who were born in the new land, in the new world as such, but they had Spanish parents. And then we have people who were mixed with natives as well as Spanish, and then we have indigenous, and then we have Africans. So as we see from this created a really important thing to note, hierarchical structure, which created popular Catholicism with the Spaniards and people at the bottom, indigenous and enslaved Africans, having a mixture of their belief systems mixed with Catholicism, because they didn't know certain parts, or this is just what they were educated on, certain parts, and the way they took it on was a mix. So it mixed the culture as well as the belief systems. This is important to note as well as a side thing, which we'll go into more later as a starting point, that this created what was called a patronatos, or this was based on what was called a patronatos because of the fact that, which means the state owned the church. And this meant that the church could do whatever they wanted to evangelize. They didn't have to go back to the European Pope as such, the European mainland of Catholicism, because they were removed and they decided to do that. Therefore, they were unregulated. This meant very extreme situations happened. In 1808 to 1825, we now see independence, which created a national patronatos. So we now know what patronatos is, but they wanted smaller versions within independence of multiple countries. We also see Enlightenment anti-Catholicism. This was the other political leaning going on at the time, and this was an anti-Catholic state. This was a secular state. This created a huge divide within these countries, so extreme that actually two wars broke out. One, the War of Reform in 1858 to 1861, and the other, which was called the Cristero War, from 1926 to 1929. So we can see this was going on year by year by year to such extremes that we see massive breakout. So into the 19th to the 20th century, Protestants were more accepted. This is when the movement of Protestantism was starting to come over. They weren't incredibly accepted, but they were more openly accepted. At this point, we now start to see, as mentioned earlier, missionaries making their movement, but with a very different outlook. Their focus was on something which generated a term called liberation theology. They gave preferential treatment for the poor. This made the Catholic Church have new political leanings to support the growth of Catholicism, as there was a fear of overrule by the Protestants. This meant a decline within the Catholic Church. There has been a rise and decrease over time of faith in church, but I think what this highlights is that when there was a focus on liberation and ACT, people were much more inclined to lean towards that, understandably, over people forcing their faith on people through violent evangelism. So ACTs do much more than the church itself, and even within Protestantism, when there were ACTs, there was more people coming to faith than the church being built and being there as an establishment. So this is the difference between mission work and aid versus creating a church. So in 1968, we see a meeting that happened which was called which was the Ecumenist movement, which was from the Medellin Conference. This was a focus, when I say the Ecumenist movement, which developed a priority not just on one denomination, but on lots of different denominations, prioritizing that they work together and focus on preferential treatment for the poor and education for the poor and biblical translations for the poor, etc., all for the poor. This created huge movements within Protestantism. And this was the focus of prioritizing not the fact that we have all these different denominations. When we'll remove them, we'll still keep them, but we prioritize something much bigger as the wider body of church. As Vahadian says, and I quote, or he quotes, Protestantism helps to create a persons who correspond and to contribute to the change in social structures and mentality. Last slide. We now see a rapid growth from 1968 to 2000s with Pentecostal and traditional Protestantism. We see more within Pentecostal, but we do see a decline within Catholic dominance. We now see Latin America becoming the major centre of global Christianity, and we also see a variety of different countries taking on different amounts of Pentecostal to traditional beliefs. But as you can see, Pentecostal takes the lump sum. So where does it put us today? Well, what we do know now is that preferential treatment for the poor, Acton works and trying to not go over to colonize, but to give the good news and help and bring something that helps to a country and aids, rather than us thinking that we're more dominant, is the thing that we should be doing, and that's what makes people come to faith. It also takes away the hierarchical structures and focus on people rather than our authority. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.